Hi, I'm Bobby Halton, and welcome to today's Google Hangout. We'll be talking today with Peter McBride from Ottawa, Canada, with my good friend Rob Schnepp from California, and with Alan Rome from Fire-Dex. And today we're going to be discussing smoke, toxicity, the fire ground, carcinogens, bunker gear, and what we can do to better protect ourselves on the fire ground from the dangers of smoke and the environment where we work. We'll also probably talk a little bit about thermodynamics because we've got the right people today on the call. Peter McBride from Ottawa has done extensive studies on fire behavior. He was one of the earliest people to talk about smoke in terms of not only its toxicity, but also in terms of reading smoke. Early on, in the early days, he was working with Dave Dodson and others when that concept was very, very new. So he's really been at the tip of the spear of all of this for the last 20 years. And now he's really considered, in my opinion, one of the foremost leading architects of the discussion internationally as it regards fire behavior, fire tactics, and clearly smoke and cancers on his radar screen. On the other side of the coin, we've got Rob Schnepp, who's from California. And Rob has done just an incredible amount of work on the actual physiology of our body's reactions to smoke, what's smoke made out of, what it affects, how it affects it, and some of the ways that we can better protect ourselves. And Rob's a board member, actually, of the, if you go to smoke.org, the real name of the group is the Coalition for Cyanide Poisoning. And that was early on in the days when we were just trying to get the cyanide antidote out there, hydroxycobalamin, now the cyanide kit, but as an antidote to hydrogen cyanide poisoning. And Rob was early on was an early adopter of that and did a great job. And we're being brought to you today by our good friends at Fire-Dex. And Fire-Dex is one of the leading manufacturers of quality bunker gear and personal protective equipment. If you haven't gone to their site, firedex.com, please do so after this broadcast, and you'll see tremendous gear made of the highest quality standards here in the United States. Absolutely fantastic company. Their operations chief sits on the NFPA committee that oversees bunker gear, so they know exactly what they're doing. They're wonderful people, and they're allowing they're paying for this time so that we can talk about your gear and smoke and all of those issues, and have a subject matter expert on with us, Alan. And Alan's going to be able to answer some of those questions we have about what is this doing to our gear, what's it doing to us, and then how can we better protect ourselves, and what are some of the limitations as well as some of the capabilities of our gear. So, and I think that's some important stuff, and it's time we have those discussions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you my good friends Alan, Pete, and Rob, and yeah, first day with that new brain. It's the break-in period. If you have a question and you want to ask us a question, this is as high-tech as I get. Send your questions to hashtag FETalk. You can just Twitter them right in. So hashtag FETalk on Twitter, and you can ask any question you want. We've got one of our folks standing by, Brandon, and Brandon will hand me the question, and we'll ask Rob, we'll ask Peter, we'll ask Alan, whatever you send in. So if you have a question about gear, about smoke, about fire behavior, about smoke toxicity, or what some of the innovative folks around the country are doing to better protect their people, now's the time. So I guess I'll start off, Rob, with you, if you don't mind. If you wouldn't mind telling everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with smoke, and then what do you think the number one or the leading danger in smoke is today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on the show, first of all. I'm with the Alameda County Fire Department out here in the East Bay of California, right near Oakland. And pushing up on 30 years in the fire service, and got interested in this really slowly, actually, in that I realized that I was feeling horrible after structure fires, and I had my own sort of epiphany after a car fire in a Pontiac Fiero, which I later found out was a cyanide wagon. When fighting a car fire with no SCBA, I basically went out. And from that point on, it raised my curiosity about smoke. And back then, you know, SCBAs were really almost considered novel, and people weren't wearing them on interior structure fires. So to me, it became an interesting topic because I just wondered why and what was in the smoke that made me feel bad, because I think back then, and even to some degree today, people think about, well, smoke, carbon monoxide, that's probably the biggest thing in there, and there's a few other things, but it's just smoke. And that approach to it, I think, is needing to be changed, and is starting to change in some ways. But started to do some research, consulted a friend of mine who's a combustion chemist down at Caltech in Pasadena, and I said, wow, I'm really trying to understand combustion and the byproducts of combustion, and I'd love to get my hands around this. And he said, well, if you ever do, let me know, because I've been studying it for like 30 years, and it's really kind of pernicious. So did my own beginning the research to try to understand the byproducts of combustion, and the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know. It started to snowball until about 2005, and did the first talk there at FDIC. And what I love about where we sit now is that first class on smoke had about 10 people in it, and now we're getting big audiences all around the country with the Fire Smoke Coalition, which you can go to on firesmoke.org, which is a shameless plug for that.
No,
but
please.
So my take on this is that really, to understand a lot of what we're going to talk about today, or what's talked about in the fire service, it really boils down to education and what you have to know about what is generated during structure fires. And the abbreviated laundry list is you can really look at it by families. I mean, you get aldehydes and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, particulates, soot, carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, sulfur compounds, chlorinated compounds, water, carbon dioxide. I mean, you name it, whatever's involved in the combustion is going to be given off to some degree. But I think, to simplify it, you could look at it this way and say there's things you can see and things you can't see, and those things you can't see are pretty much gaseous chemicals. Some are carcinogens, some are toxic, and then the particulates. And this topic today, when we talk about bunker gear and contamination and that sort of thing, I think the particulates are really on the side of the equation that we're really starting to look at. So that's a bit about how I got here and interested in the topic. And as I say, with firesmoke.org, we've got a lot of great information, and we learn more every day. And I think people, and I mean firefighters and EMS providers, are starting to really increase their awareness, and I think that needle is going in the right direction. But what I think is happening is many more questions are getting asked, and I know we hit on it today, but how clean is my bunker gear? How often should I wash it? Do I need to take a shower? Why does my watch smell for 3 days after a fire? How come my hair smells the second time I take a shower? All that sort of thing. So that's a bit about how I got here.
Good. Pete, why don't you fill people in on what you're working on? A couple of great projects. Fill folks in on that, a little background stuff, and then tell us a little bit about what you're doing up there in Canada with your organizations to reduce your members' exposure to toxicity.
Well, I'm in my 28th year with the Ottawa Fire Service. I jokingly say I have 54 years of service, because my father was 37 years and my eldest brother was a similar number. I think I've been spending most of my time unlearning most of the lessons my father taught me. And I say that with deepest respect, is, these older guys that come home, and as Rob has pointed out, no BA, or gear that wouldn't have been cleaned, patch coat, rubber boots, very limited protection, poor PPE basically, coupled with very poor, as we describe it today, as industrial hygiene. And I think that when we talk about this, I think we need to sort of give it a structure. And in the Canadian environment, we have I think we have because we have a smaller population, and because we have a different environmental and regulatory environment, I should say, is that our legislation is very specific about the provincial application of laws as they apply to firefighters. And so there's a legal requirement to ensure that you have an industrial hygiene process or a program within the workplace. And this has never been applied, much like they had the BAs at one point, and we're not wearing them because really we're firefighters, we don't need them, right? So there's that sort of, it's always, the fire department is a little different, but in my case, I started as a safety officer at a certain point in my career, and I started looking at all these problems, and certainly from what I'd read from other documents as they relate to, as Rob had identified, was, when you talk about smoke, it's gases, particles, and liquids, and when you look at those three phases of matter and how they go across, our skin, how they interact with our internal organs, I really started to look at that, and as it relates to some of the stuff that I learned from taking a safety diploma and in understanding industrial hygiene. And so that's the model that I'm bringing to this problem. And when I started looking at that, I guess it was 2 years ago, Bobby, or was it 3? I did that article on nanoscale materials because, again, we had experience here in Ottawa where we had a large sporting goods store catch fire. In that process, we discovered nanoscale materials.
That was in the summer of 11, so that would have been 3 years, Pete.
Yeah. So essentially, that event happened probably about 2 years before that. But when we started looking at that problem, and I started to look at some of the research that was out there, it really scared me. I had an understanding of, I used the great American Air Force is, a lot of the stealth planes, and they're using nanoscale carbon nanotube, assemblies and what have you, and the literature associated with that, and people who had been involved in crashes, the crash sites are, quite dangerous because of these carbon nanotubes and what have you. So when you start looking at all this, materials, the material science being our biggest challenge, we are the consequence managers, and this new technology is being introduced at rates which we, quite frankly, haven't kept up with the consequences of its failure. And so I started looking at it from those perspectives. And so in terms of projects that we have going on here is I'm working with the Ministry of Labor, the WSIB, which is our workers' compensation, and McMaster University to do a firefighter exposure study. And our preliminary results from the first round, which I presented in 2011, I believe, 20 minutes in wood smoke is the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes. And that's using U.S. data to match against wildland fire and people who smoke. There's a thing called the NHANES, which is the North American Health Medical Assessment System that's in the States. And essentially they have data for persons who smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, 2 packs, 1 pack, and we match that to wood smoke exposures. And as we look at the metabolites post that exposure, that 20 minutes in smoke is the equivalent of smoking that pack of cigarettes.
So you're saying, like, if you're just sitting around a campfire, Peter, outside in the ambient air?
I'm talking about in full PPE. I'm talking about having firefighters go into a burning building.
Okay.
We have 2 pallets of spruce pine fir, 1 of oak, 2 bales of straw. We'll be doing that test again tomorrow with 8 more firefighters. And when we did it in 2011, 20 minutes exposure to pure just wood smoke. That's no plastics, no anything, just wood smoke. And that's across your body. So that's the liquids, the gases, and the particulates. And what we found in that study was down 10 chemicals that are only associated with particles. So that kind of confirms to me that these particles are passing through the suits, across the skin, the blood-brain barrier, and we're seeing it in in the metabolites because that's the only way it could get into our body. We evaluate their urine 24 hours beforehand. On the day of, we swab various parts of their body. They're kitted up. They're sent in for 20 minutes. They're removed, taken their kit off, swabbed, pee test, and we collect their pee for another 24 hours. And so we can actually see the drop-off and how maybe some clues as to how we could manage this better. So we're repeating that study tomorrow tomorrow morning. It's starting at 8 o'clock. Another area of study that we're looking at, I was this year at FDIC, our good friend Dave Burnswig roped me into 1581. the task group. So I've been working with them on some of the issues of how to clean gear. Quite a big focus on, are we cleaning the gear that we're cleaning? Is it coming out clean? And looking at a list of elements that really impact what we're exposed to, and it's quite extensive list of products, from inorganic chemicals, heavy metals, if you will, inorganic chemicals, cation, cyanide, as Rob has pointed out, volatile organic chemicals, semi-volatile organics, and of course biologicals. And so in that 1581, there's work being undertaken to develop a prospectus to the National Fire Protection Research Foundation to undertake some study, or a series of studies that might assist us in determining how well we are, or are we being effective in our cleaning. Another project, Bobby, is I've got the grant for the Fire Dynamics program, which is a $4 million pop, and what we're doing there is we're developing a fire dynamics, the curriculum as well as the content, which we intend to give away globally. But we're embedding in that. Forgive the phone there. We're embedding in that both the rehab and industrial hygiene. So when we teach firefighters that they go to rehab, there will be an industrial hygiene component in terms of how they manage that, so they reduce their load as they relates to any training or actual live fire. As you have already implemented in Ottawa an industrial hygiene program that our guys, we treat our bunker gear as if it's biological pathogens post-fire. So it's bagged and tagged. I'd seen brought back to a depot, put in the machine, in the bag gets sliced. It does a quick wetting agent event, then it's torn apart and placed for proper washing. And so essentially we have our guys going for showers within the hour wherever we can. So we have this whole process of where we're trying to reduce the dose, the poison being the dose, and so we're dropping those numbers if we can, or the level of exposure. So we're employing very basic industrial hygiene practices. So it's a multi-tentacled approach to managing industrial hygiene across even the people who are receiving the product, our people in our depots, our SCBA depot, how we clean up and so on and so forth. So really having a hard look at it.
You kind of dropped off, Pete. Did we lose your signal?
Still hear me? Okay. Yeah. So our objective is through these various efforts is to really try to understand what and how we're being exposed, what we can do about it. Some very, very interesting things comes from 300 years ago, and that involved chimney sweeps. And this Jeremy Potts, who was basically the first industrial hygienist, discovered that 12-year-old boys were having testicular, even 7-year-olds were having testicular cancer. And this was as a result of exposure to creosote. And when he looked in France, compared to England, France had a little more favor with washing, just basic bathing. And whereas the British, if you remember, Queen Victoria took a bath once a month, whether she needed it or not, the concept was that bathing was where disease was from. And then if you went to the Germans actually had laws in place that required these chimney sweeps to wear tight-fitting clothes and bathe every day. And the incidence of testicular cancer in German chimney sweeps was almost non-existent compared to the British example, and then if you look at the French example, it's somewhere in the middle. So this data really, old and it really points the way. It's about proper PPE and proper hygiene to reduce the dose and effectively limit or reduce the degree of exposure that firefighters get. I also would say it is of critical importance that we in the fire service understand that there's a big experiment underway in North America, or I'll call it in the Western world, and that's called carbon nanotechnology. It's bigger, better, faster, stronger. And as consequence managers, we, the fire service, as I said earlier, are responding to technology that fails. And I'll give you an example. A flat screen TV is done by vapor deposition. And that vapor deposition loads up billions of carbon nanotubes. And when we have a fire, we liberate that stuff. We've always had nanoscale materials at fires, but now we have man-made nanoscale. A bus fire with a 800 or 700 pound lithium-ion battery pack on top of it. To get that energy density, they use nanoscale lithium. And when it's liberated, in and of itself, lithium is toxic. But when you nanoscale it, you allow it to translocate to the body very easily. And that's one of the things that they found with this technology is, and I think it was your own FDA that did this study in relation to persons who had Alzheimer's. They used carbon nanotubes. They put a drug in the carbon nanotubes and then allowed that nanotube to be introduced to the body. And their attempt was to get it across the blood-brain barrier. And when they did the post-mortems, they had found that these materials had located throughout the body. And what that tells us is, if I go back to my study with McMaster and the WSIB, is we know we've had nanoscale materials deliver chemicals to our body in that study. We found 10 chemicals that weren't there before, and those chemicals are only associated with particles. That's how they get into the body. And so that, if I look at that study that was done for FDA, and how when they did the autopsy, these materials had basically been found in the liver, the lungs, everywhere, as well as the brain. What that tells me is that's the mechanism, or one of the key mechanisms, aside from the gaseous state, if you will, perfusing across your skin. That's why, 3 or 4 days after you get out of fire and you're showering, you think you're having an Alzheimer's moment. No, it's coming out of your pores, right? And so this other methodology of the particulate going through, and I think it's highly toxic. I've had some industrial hygienists explain to me that the carbon expands as it's heated, and the chemical rests within, the molecule rests within that carbon, that swollen carbon molecule, and as it cools, it's now sort of like a little needle taking the chemical into your body. And so we don't understand enough of this, I think, but this experiment is going, and I'm quite concerned for the fire service, and I think it's really, really important that we implement basic industrial hygiene practices, and we start doing some serious monitoring. And some of the efforts, as I said, at 1581, at looking, are we actually cleaning our gear? Because I don't think we know.
So just a quick recap then, the basic, what you want to call rudimentary precautions that we can take that you've already begun up there in Ottawa is to isolate the gear as soon as possible at a fire scene, to have the gear cleaned as thoroughly as possible, and to have our members shower and as thoroughly as possible, as quickly as possible, following every fire.
Without question. And the thing is, Bobby, it's another thing, I'm looking for the paper, but it's been articulated to me, is that how you shower can be as important as how big your dose is that if you think about, you first want to mechanically remove it, before you start rubbing it in. I can place a chemical on your hand, on both palms of your hand, and I can take soap and start getting it away with soap. If you think about how and what we do for infection control, the idea is that you first mechanically remove it, no chemicals, and then you wash with a soap. First you wet your hand. And I think that this is actually very important because we have dead skin cells on top and oils. And if we start using chemicals first, so lathering on the soap before we've done the mechanical rinsing, I think we might increase the dose. So this is another area that we need to look at and that's kind of where we're looking at. We're saying we should be linking industrial hygiene practices to our infection control because they're very closely related. So as an approach, that's what we've started to communicate within our workplace.
Wow. Wow. And I know there's several departments in the United States, down in Florida in particular, that I'm aware of, a few friends down there. This policy is being implemented now in the United States and several departments in Florida. I haven't heard of too many other places, although anecdotally some people have mentioned to me that they have. I think it's probably going to be a growing trend. I'm going to bring in Alan Rome real quick. Alan's from Fire-Dex. He's a national sales manager. Can give us some great insight. Alan, after hearing Rob talk about the general toxicity of smoke and his adventures with just some of the inhalation issues and some of the other things, and then Peter talking to us now about nanoparticulates and how quickly they can invade our bodies and throughout our bodies, whether it's through the dermal layers into our kidneys and our livers and our endocrine systems, which is where cancer becomes a really dynamic problem, if you will, to combat. What's going on in the gear industry? And there's probably some questions out there, and I'm getting a few from my Twitter feed. And if you do have a question, you're out there, just tweet your question to #FETalk. That's #FETalk on Twitter. And we've gotten several questions already. I'll ask the group. But Alan, talk to us a little bit about what are the folks on your side of the equation doing, and how are you improving our gear, and what are some of your recommendations for what we should be doing?
Sure. Thank you, Bobby. Brave firefighters have been putting out fires for several hundred years around the world, so nothing new there. We've had a big chemical change in wet burns in the last 50 years. You guys are very aware of that. What has changed in the last 2 years, since 3 or 4 very high-profile reports were published, is the fire services addressing specifically what they're exposed to. So fire's been around for a long time, firefighters been around for a long time. We've been exposed to some bad stuff for a very long time. Got worse in the last 40, 50 years. What's changed is our ability to be aware of it and react to it. So cleansing, proper PPE, and things like that. A couple things I do want to talk about, though, on the PPE for firefighters. Firefighters are used to dealing with a lot of metal. A heavy-duty fire truck, brass nozzles and fittings and couplers, tools and axes and things like that. These are very heavy-duty pieces of equipment that can withstand a tremendous amount of use, abuse, and reuse. The PPE, typically, with the exception of the rubber soles on the bottom of a boot or a fiberglass helmet, the rest of the PPE that we're protected by are cloth-based items. So the cloth just isn't going to be able to take that long-term exposure or abuse as a piece of metal could, specifically addressing cleaning. So if your tools are dirty, you wash them, that's great. Your fire truck's dirty, you wash it the way you wash it, the fire truck's not going to be damaged. Cloth, as great as the cloth does, the 3 layers protect you from heat, fire, and fluids, they just simply can't withstand 50 washes. So it's a balance between, I'm spending $2,000 on a set of bunker gear, it's $2,500 if you add boots, helmets, and gloves and hoods to it, and I'm washing it after every fire exposure, which is a lot of people's policies. Just keep in mind, from a budgetary point of view, you're not going to get 2 to 7 years out of that bunker gear because it's cloth. It's simply not made for that level of agitation in the machines, which is why NFPA 1851 or your FEMSA user guide that comes attached to every piece of PPE that you buy talks specifically about what types of machines, what type of chemical, what type of detergent, temperature of the water, temperature of the air, the speed, the RPMs of the tumbler, and things like that. Those are all things that we're trying to do to keep the cloth in play as long as possible. Firefighters know they're supposed to wear their PPE. There are some great studies, very specifically, Tualatin Valley did a study that was released in 2011. It very specifically addresses the nasty chemicals that are at a fire scene for the first 45 minutes after extinguishment. So high recommendation to wear full PPE for 45 minutes. In April of 2013 in Indianapolis, 40 of our peers got together, sponsored by the Firefighter Cancer Support Network, and published these 11 points on how to handle your PPE and practices that you as a firefighter should take on to make yourself safe. Wearing the PPE longer, tagging it doing a mass decon at the scene, taking a proper shower back at the station, things that the Ottawa is already aware of because they got some great skills on out. But there are some things that firefighters that are watching this event can download to help get incorporated into your procedures. Bobby made reference to Florida. In Jacksonville, Florida, they issued in November of 13 an instructional bulletin. That's something that Jacksonville uses. On page 2 of that instructional bulletin, it very specifically talks about how PPE stays on at certain types of fires and what gets done back at the station. A lot of fire departments don't have a lot of labor or money maybe to write new standards and things like that. I'm okay with plagiarizing. Let's find another fire department who's already put forth the effort, like the two big departments on the conference today, and let's find somebody like Jacksonville, another good-sized, well-funded department. Let's find somebody who's already addressed some of these topics and bring their PPE policies or safety policies into your departments. So not only are departments that are very aware of this and can afford to address it, such as 2 sets of bunker gear for everybody, extractors at everybody's machines, or I'm sorry, at everybody's station. Let's get all the departments to try to do the best they can to be aware of it, have policies to protect their men and women from it.
That's outstanding. You know, guys, I'm going to bring everybody in together, so just chime in if you have a thought on some of these questions that I've gotten while you all were speaking. Folks have been asking some great questions. One of the questions that came up, and I think Rob and Pete in particular, and Alan, I don't know how much you know about this side of it, but a very interesting question. We got a tweet and asked about what do we think the exclusionary zone will be going forward for respiratory protection in particular, but in light of Pete's comments, even for nanoparticulate protection. In other words, right now, and let's just, this is us, we're insiders, and
I'd like to speak to that, Bobby.
Pardon?
I'd like to speak to that. The current NFPA descriptors for exclusion zones I created. The steam tape and what have you. That was post an event. Actually, it was in California, and I was doing a lecture at the Fresno. North California Training Officers event, and I heard of a horrible story involving an electrical death. They lifted the yellow tape, and so we created the distinctions between red, yellow, and exclusionary zones, and so on and so forth. And this question is just bang on as it relates to that exclusionary zone. It depends, and so that's why I was pointing out those buses. Our firefighters were tackling a bus fire, and when I realized what it was, I went, this thing has a footprint of blocks. A house fire, as you're sniffing it, and so really, as a public service, when my safety officers go into a bond, where one of the things we do is we set up exclusionary zones, and we're pushing that stuff out, and I articulate to my guys, and I have done it as a safety officer myself. I'd see people standing there with their children, and I say, if you can smell it or taste it, you're in the wrong place. Those are poisons you're breathing, and this is not a wood fire. This is plastics and chemicals. And very quickly they take their kids away. And we really need to emphasize that message, and it is a bigger footprint, and in some cases it can be up to blocks. We don't have that realization. There's huge consequence to fire, and that's what I keep saying about we're the consequence managers, and we better understand that footprint, and we better understand the footprint on the person doing the work, and the people we serve.
Great points.
Well, Bobby, what's funny about this discussion is that the more and more we get around the country and around the world, people are beginning to talk about fire scenes like hazmat scenes, and it's an interesting transition because, we were doing RIT and hazmat before RIT was cool in the fire service, and we're talking about decontamination, we're talking about exclusion zones, and while I don't subscribe to or really promote that a fire will be handled in the same way a hazmat call will in terms of its tactics and strategy, I do think acknowledging that, and this is probably a myth-busting thing, is most people think that the when they say they see smoke, what they're saying is that I see the visible particulates that were liberated by the combustion process. But what they don't see are the gases, and the particulate footprint and the gas footprint can be vastly different based on your environmental sorts of influences, inversion layers, humidity, all these sorts of things, how hot the fire's burning, is it ventilated? And you know you've pulled up to these fires where the smoke's laying down on the street, and first in engine typically parks right at the address, and the pump operator is pretty much right there, and battalion chiefs, and they're almost like magnets to the drift smoke. You know, wherever that smoke is, that's where we have our guy from the fire typically hangs out. And I think that when we start looking at this, really you can say, you know, if you want to start at some basic level to set a hot zone, it's the lot of the house or the building. I mean, that's a good place to start. That, you know, once you cross that sidewalk, you're probably getting close enough that you definitely ought to have respiratory protection on. Now, as Pete says, which is absolutely true, it varies from fire to fire. It could be blocks, could be, you know, wildland fire like we do out here, it could be miles, but that's where detection and monitoring can come in, where you can, you know, find a marker gas like carbon monoxide, and you can say, well, we're getting some levels here, so that might mean there's other gaseous substances around. So, you know, for my 2 cents, I think it's really one of these things. It's funny that I think what we're doing is we're going to great lengths to find technical data to convince us of stuff we already know, that smoke is bad, and we're wandering around in it. So if you're you know, your RIT team typically will just, they're right there in the front yard in the drift smoke, running around doing a lap around the building. And so, you know, by the time you activate a RIT team, they're probably already compromised by the smoke. So it's all those little things. You know, honestly, I think interior structure firefighting people are wearing their SCBAs now. It's that ancillary stuff that we're still getting exposed. Outside vent, working on the roof, RIT team, where the engine's set up, where the BC's set up, defensive firefighting.
Well, I think
we're sucking down all that smoke that's bad.
You know, I think back to the Providence, Rhode Island fire back in 2006, I believe it was, where the pump operator was overcome, and it turned out to be hydrogen cyanide poisoning. And just by the grace of God, there was a doc who was doing a study at the time at the hospital that they went to, who was messing around with hydroxycobalamin, and who administered it to these particular group of firefighters that came in. But one of the firefighters that was overcome was the pump operator, and you know, he was out in the street, what we would call the street, where, you know, our RIT teams would be, our folks would be, you know, manning the pumps, setting up the ladders, setting up the air supply, the rehab. I mean, all of this has, you know, and given what Peter was just talking about with, you know, nanoparticulates now, you know, you really wonder how we're going to create these zones and how we're going to manage them better into the future. And I think that we need to be talking about it. We need to be visioning those things now, because, and this is no news to you guys. I mean, you know, two of my closest compadres here in the fire service. Change in the fire service, adaptation is probably a better word, because change is a stupid word. Yeah, everybody wants people to change, just not themselves. So I think adaptation is a better word. But adaptation in the fire service is really a generational process. It's 20 to 30 years. And you hate to say that. Maybe it'll accelerate. I don't know. Hopefully it will. But, you know, we're not going to get folks to pack up a block away, you know, in the immediate future. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take, as Peter knows, and Rob, you too. I mean, right now we like evidence-based data. We like evidence-based tactics. In other words, show me why you think this is correct with concrete experience and fireground knowledge, coupled by good research, coupled by thorough investigation, coupled by examination of alternatives, and then coupled by not a consensus, if you will, but at least a group of subject matter experts who've gotten some consensus on it, some thought that we should be moving this way, because there's always going to be a certain amount of nuance and as you guys said so eloquently, I could never hope to match it. Barometric pressure, wind direction, temperature, all of that's going to affect it. But I think what scares me, and this is a question I wrote down, in the future, based upon what Peter and our good friends in Canada are doing, a pack of cigarettes from 20 minutes exposure to wood smoke, and our wildland firefighters go out there for weeks breathing that smoke. And what are the ramifications of that? And are we going to see our hot shots in the future wearing some kind of lightweight air pack to protect them? I mean, the implications are huge. Is it just me, or am I overreacting?
No, I think it's really. Well, go ahead.
I would just say briefly, we're talking about a culture problem. If you really, I think, reverse engineer this all the way back out to what's the root reason that we're having all these other discussions, it's a culture problem. And we've got 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, and there's still people who think wearing an SCBA is a bad thing or unneeded, or you've somehow lost your fireman license if you're wearing an SCBA, and that still exists. It's less, but it still exists. And I think what has to happen really is, as you mentioned, Bobby, is the cultural needle has to change, and I think it is. But I think we have to come to the realization that the logic goes like this. Combustion liberates gases and liquids and particulates. Those gases and liquids and particulates are bad for us. They get on us, they get in us, they get on our gear, they get in our gear, and until or unless we're willing to wear the SCBA in a prudent fashion, that doesn't mean from the time you get on the rig probably till the time you get to the scene, but in a prudent fashion, and acknowledge the fact that these things are there, and we need to get them off our gear, get them off our body, and we take reasonable and prudent measures to do that, then we'll start to see the needle change. And to me, success is reduction in firefighter cancer, reduction in the amount of people that feel like crap after a fire. And I had a guy once say, well, all this science, are you sure that this is not just, smoke and mirrors to try and get, to have admin tell us to wear our SCBAs more often? And I said, well, did you feel bad after the last fire you went to? And he said, yes. And I said, well, there you go. It's really no more complicated than that in some respects. So I think we're all sitting here talking about a cultural change at our fundamental core in the fire service that has to absolutely happen for people to get this.
Bobby, think about some of the other first responders and how different they handle things. Imagine a police officer on his shift. He wears his bulletproof vest in many police departments around the world, and he wears his badge and his gun his entire shift. He would never think about taking the badge, the gun, or the bulletproof vest off, because that's part of his shift apparel. A firefighter's not going to wear an SCBA in his entire shift, but I think everybody acknowledges now that they need to wear it longer after the scene. Whereas firefighters on the opposite end, they can't wait to get that mask off. They can't wait to get those gloves off or get that coat off. So two public service workers, first responders, with two dramatically opposed thoughts about their own PPE. Wears it the entire shift and can't wait to take it off after the 20 minutes of wearing it. So big cultural divide there. Secondly, it is changing.
Big comfort and dexterity issue too. I mean,
absolutely,
let's
no
be
question
honest.
about it.
I've worn a bulletproof vest, and they are uncomfortable, but you can tolerate them for 8 hours.
Right.
8 hours in an air pack.
Sure.
And you're all about getting it off.
Yeah, no, certainly, obviously, nobody's going to purport wearing an air pack for the half a shift or a shift, but wearing it 45 minutes after the scene, maybe, or wearing it for 20 minutes after the extinguishment, let's work on that. The second point is, it is fixable. The four guys on this Google Hangout today, none of us wore hats, protective helmets, when we rode bicycles and mini bikes as kids. All four of us on the thing, our children today, I'm sure, wear some type of helmet protection on bicycles, mini bikes, and motorcycles. So personal protection is changeable. The attitudes, the paradigm can be shifted, but it does take a long time. And I can tell you, in the last 3 years, this whole cancer subject comes up at every national show I go to, regional, and on a state level. When I go to a Florida fire chief show, there's a breakout session every day about firefighter fitness, firefighter exposure to bad things, the whole cancer situation, which is his own monster, proper PPE and things like that. So huge improvements in the last 3 years compared to where we were 10 years ago or certainly 20 years ago.
But what you said, Alan, and I'll have Pete chime in a second here, but what you said goes and reinforces my earlier point. 10 years ago, I wrote a piece called Tip of the Iceberg, and I was talking about cancer and the fact that 10 years before that, we started talking about it. And in 1990, I wrote my first article about hydroxycobalamin, and there are still places, as Rob can attest to, that don't even have the cyanide kits and don't even know yet. So
right.
we're a huge, we're 1.8 million folks here in North America, in America, and then with our Canadian brothers and sisters, we're probably over 2 million plus just here in North America, and then with South America, and then before Pete chimes in on some of the, because I have some questions that came in for Peter about batteries and automobiles, because he mentioned the buses, and we got tweeted a question about, does that also relate, those lithium batteries, does that also relate to the Priuses and things like that? But before we go there, I think it's important that when we talk about culture, there are aspects of the firefighter culture which are just incredible, and we never want to change them. In other words, our artifacts, our institutions, our virtues and our values are sacrosanct. They're inalienable. In other words, you can't find a higher calling, you can't find a more virtuous or noble profession. What you're talking about specifically, Rob, is normative, and that's behavioral, and that's a part of our culture. But the normative part, and that is all dictated by what we tolerate, what we say is okay and not okay, and that is up to us, and that should evolve with increased knowledge, and as Peter said, with the new threats, with the new technological threats that we're creating. When the firefighters first began in 08 AD under Emperor Augustus, all they wore was wool cloth, and they used poles to pull down other buildings. We've come a long way, and we'll go further, and I think we'll go there because of guys like Rob Schnepp and Pete McBride. That you're going to set the tone. The question that came in for Alan, and I hate to push you guys along, but I got a page full of questions here. I'm getting people are lighting up my what do you call that stuff you get messages on your phone?
Notifications.
Yeah, no, my tech guy looked at me like I'm old. But a question came in about helmet liners, and this relates directly to they related it directly to the hood issue. We've just kind of found out that our hoods, and I've had thyroid cancer, so I can kind of relate to this, that we're getting a higher incidence of thyroid cancer, and they think it's because the hoods hang down on our necks, and the absorption rate right there is so close to our thyroids. So this one's kind of near and dear to me. But this question came in and said, we decon our gear, we decon all our gear, but not our helmet liners. And what were your thoughts? And maybe Pete, you might be doing something with helmet liners. How often are we cleaning those? And does anybody have any suggestions for the person who tweeted that?
Certainly, Bobby. We post-fire liners are done, hoods are done. We have a process for gloves. We have a process for boots. So yeah, we definitely encourage our staff to do that, and we have written SOPs with photographs on all the steps they're to take. And then they come to the depot and they can get another set of gear. We're not at a stage where we have 2 sets of gear, but I think eventually that's where we'll end up. But as an interim step, we have about 400 spare sets of gear, and that manages the problem for us today. Eventually, I believe that's where we'll end up, is 2 sets of gear. An expensive proposition for any fire department. And then, again, it's about, as Rob identified, it's understanding those basic rules, which are, let me back up. I'll say that we keep referencing the SCBA. Our studies show full SCBA, the exposure is occurring because the gas is coming across your skin. And I'll use a fire I had here in Ottawa. In 10.5 hours on scene, it was a massive block-long fire, a hardware store, pink flames, green flames, blue flames I'd never seen before. And I wore BA on the clock for 6.5 hours. I want to know how many packs of cigarettes I had that day. So one major fire can be a lot of cigarettes. And so the whole idea of you know, being able to properly gauge what your exposure is not something that we're able to do. And it could be one fire that gets you, it could be a lifetime of fires that gets you in terms of your exposures. So it's incumbent on us, because you don't know what's going to happen today or tomorrow, it's incumbent on us to sort of look at the problem from the perspective of basic industrial hygiene. And basic industrial hygiene, the term is as low as reasonably possible. Keep it as low as reasonably possible. So you have to implement basic rules. And when Rob identified, well, we're not going to put the tape 4 blocks out to say come in and out. What we did to do some of the cultural change within our organization is we kept the tape in the safety officer's pocket, and we would wrap it around the red zone, hot zone, and it's conceptual. We would tie the red tape to the front porch or on a tree out front and say, and the guy would look at it and go, hot zone, full kit, right? And so, that is how we got the cultural change to happen. And once people started to understand the tapes and what the tape meant for them, they started to comply and wearing their BA. So we have a very good BA compliance, I would say, generally, from areas that I've looked at in other places, because we really do an education piece on this aspect of industrial hygiene. So it takes the education, it takes the enforcement, and it takes the appropriate equipment to manage the problem. And if you actually look at what the cost is, it's really cheap to implement basic industrial hygiene. A bunny suit is between $5 and $7. That's a throwaway bunny suit. A tieback type suit. That's what we're paying. So we're stripping down the street a bag. We figure the bag is worth $2. That's the bag we put the gear in and we throw away later. The tags, 25 cents a tag. Ask yourself, sending a firefighter to a fire, is it worth and if you want to put cleaning costs on, is it worth $100 to make sure they're safe? I think it is. If you add the cleaning and all the other stuff that goes with it, $100 is cheap insurance, because you don't know what that exposure is, and we have no way to characterize it other than to know that it's not healthy for you. So we want to reduce the dose.
I'd like to follow on something to that. Do we have time for that, Bobby?
Yeah, no, please.
Okay. Well, and I think, Pete, you hit on something that is absolutely mission critical here, in that when we talk about how we implement programs for change, I think that's a really tenuous place in the fire service, because I think a lot of places, a lot of agencies, I should say, default right to, we're going to try to buy our way out of the problem with equipment and infrastructure, and we're going to legislate our way out of the problem. And I think firefighters are like most people, that if they will push back against legislation without reason. And I think what's really important is, you can buy great extractors, but if people don't put them in the extractors, they do you no good. You can say wear your SCBA, but if your agency culture isn't one of compliance or loosely compliant, then people may not do that. And so I think what I would close my thoughts out with here on this particular point is to say, if you recognize smoke is an issue in your agency, then you must be thoughtful about how you will approach it in a way that you get buy-in first, and sort of the program implementation later. So if I understand the reason why I should clean my gear and what's harmful to me and the nanoparticulates and gases, I get a certain percentage of buy-in in my department, and then the cleaning piece becomes easier. So I really look at, in my own agency, I look at this and I say, so I've got a subject or an issue or a program. Do I want to do my work on the front end or the back end? So if I do the work on the front end and I decide if it's a no legislation, middle legislation, or high legislation piece, then I kind of have to balance that against the culture of my own organization to see if that's going to be successful or if people are going to push back on that. And so yeah, I think people see this smoke issue and start saying, oh God, gear's dirty, let's buy an extractor. Oh, there's bad stuff at the fire scene, well, let's buy detection and monitoring. People get exposed, well, let's buy some kind of cyanide antidote kit, and believe that the tool or the piece of equipment solves it, when in reality, if there's no buy-in in the beginning, then all that stuff and that investment that you made in whatever the solution is just going to be useless, and people aren't going to use it.
Yeah, I would concur with that evaluation, and I guess we're quite fortunate here in my jurisdiction because our legislation speaks to a concept called supervisory competency. And regardless of the problem, if you were looked at by the Ministry of Labor for any violation, and there aren't really clear rules as they relate to the fire service because historically we've been left alone. But
a little exempt, yeah.
Yeah, the concept is very clear. It's supervisory competency says you must know the law and what the rights and your obligations in the law are. You must know the hazard or the danger, and you must be able to supervise that hazard or danger. So on that very basic concept, we understand the hazard or the danger of smoke. As you described, is getting the buy-in. And the controls, we've identified those controls, which is here's a bunny suit, here's a bag, put your stuff away. Don't get in the truck because the guy that goes to get the groceries tomorrow sitting in that truck is taking it home to his kids. They could be your kids tomorrow. And so, you know, the way these materials move around. And so this is basic industrial hygiene. So we've identified the hazard, we've identified the control, and it's a very simple process. Now, we're not going to eliminate exposures, and that's why in my jurisdiction and many jurisdictions we have presumptive legislation. And it is presumed after so many years and so on. And you can argue the pros and cons of that. I prefer to work for prevention. I am glad presumptive legislation is there because I think we need it. But ultimately, we should be preventing these issues. And, you know, it takes a technological aspects of the cleaning, and it takes the understanding of the technology from the firefighter and the controls and the education. And, you know, I laud you guys for you know, doing this.
Well, this is a labor of love, as you know, Peter. You know, just so the audience knows, it took about 2 seconds when I called Pete. I said, Pete, can you give me an hour of your time to talk about smoke, cancer, toxicity, and what you're doing? He said, yeah, you say when and where, and I'm there. Same thing with Rob, same thing with Alan. You know, the love of one another, the passion that we have for each other and taking care of each other is boundless. And I think that this is just the growth of that. And I think changing these normative behavioral things is going to happen. You know, I think that driving has gotten a lot more controlled in the last 5 years because of our emphasis on safe driving. I think that, you know, very rarely do you see anybody, you know, doing active ventilation or active firefighting in what we would consider the IDLH by the classical traditional definition, you know, in the smoke. You rarely see anybody without their respiratory protection on. And now we're starting through the studies out of Canada and the other studies on smoke to advance it to even beyond what you can see. So on that, Alan, just a quick question for you, as I know that, you know, Fire-Dex is an outstanding corporation, and please, you know, when we're done with this hangout, please go to their website and take a look at the fantastic gear that you can get through Fire-Dex. It's some of the best stuff available in the country, some of the best stuff available in the world. So please always wear the best, and Fire-Dex is clearly the best. So what's going on in your organization to make, you know, Peter brought out a great point about these particulates. Is there research currently going on? Is there a fabric out there on the horizon that's going to give us more protection, that we're going to see another layer of the shell, so to speak, you know, of maybe a fourth or a fifth layer that's going to get us more, perhaps, you know, protection for our derma?
There's a lot of talk on a lot of different subjects going on right now. None of them are very well developed, with the exception of the hood, particularly, as you mentioned, and part of the dermis that's very susceptible in the throat area. So there's already one hood on the market that has a moisture barrier membrane built into the hood for just that very specific area. So your helmet is waterproof in theory from direct water overhead. Certainly your coat, pant, boot, and glove are waterproof. That's part of the NFPA 1971 standard. What's not is the hood. It's a 2-layer knit hood. It's basically a sock, tube sock, that has no fluid protection whatsoever. So hoods are the next thing that you're going to see change pretty dramatically in the next year or two.
Outstanding, outstanding.
You know, I would say that, and you know, I don't have enough evidence yet, but when we did our study, one of the things we did was we did, at the throat and the head, and we actually measured how. So we put an aluminum circle on your head, which was the center of the aluminum circle was them. So we swabbed the same area each time, and we found that other than the hands, and that's because the hands were touching the gear, we found the same level of exposure. Didn't matter if it was, on your face, on your crotch, on your back, whatever. It was a whole body exposure. The difference in the exposure was almost non-existent. What I think is being pointed out here is that it is a whole body exposure, and many of the materials that we're being exposed to exceed what are exposure limits set, certainly in my jurisdiction, for some very basic chemicals. You would not be allowed to be exposed to those chemicals over hours in a day. We're exceeding those levels in one 20-minute event. And the other aspect is that I think that has been put out with Rob and Al is that you have great vascularity in your face, great vascularity in the thin skin. Men, of course, in their crotch, and there's really good former data that relates to workers in the fruit picking industry where pesticides were used, indiscriminately, and your arms or your inner arm or under your, in your crotch, or there are different areas that tend to be more absorptive, and whether you're into wet chemistry or dry chemistry as it relates to the chemicals and the uptake. So, Rob and I could show up at a fire. We could be side by each on a line, advancing, knock it down, come out, do everything. And he could have been sweating, and I could have been dry. And, his uptake could have been tremendously greater, and mine could have been significantly less. So there's so many variables here. And again, when we look at, as Rob said earlier, some of the technology, there are benefits to, looking at the hood and what have you. And I think one of the reasons that hood has been thin for so long is I think you're going to start to see a lot more heat stress injuries once we start putting on thicker hoods. You're going to cook that brain faster. And so there are some trade-offs here that we really have to look at, and cost-benefit analysis and functionality. And we described the police officer being able to work for 8 hours, and we understand the physiological demands of bunker gear and SCBA. And if we're going to heat that person up, we're going to have to take heat out of somewhere, out of the system, because as it stands now, our firefighters, we just had like I don't know, it'd be 85 degrees, 20-some Celsius here just the other day, and I got 3 firefighters go down in the heat, right? And so I'm quite concerned about thicker hoods, from that perspective.
Absolutely. Bobby, I think Mom had it right. Wear the right clothes for the right environment, wash your clothes, and wash your body. We know that's the program. We got great materials. We just got to have better practices. It's got to be part of I learned a new word today, the normative. It's got to be part of the normative. Wash it when you get back to the station.
And norms are what we allow them to be. In other words, it's what we reward, it's what we recognize, and what we tolerate. And I think that, there'll be a day when we won't tolerate somebody not showering immediately after a fire. That we won't tolerate someone not, bunkering up and having their SCBA in place before they enter a potential IDLH. And I think the exclusionary zone is going to continue to grow, and I think people are going to appreciate that. It's the problem with invisible danger is that people can minimize it, and they can pretend like they'll be immune to it. Unfortunately, as Peter just said, we all have different receptors in our biological makeup. So an exposure that might not cause you any distress could kill your partner. Likewise, an exposure that your partner might tolerate for years, you can't tolerate for hours. It's all about the unique physiology that you bring to the equation. and that's just life. And I laugh today with there's so much talk about fairness. Nothing in life is fair. It just is what it is. You deal with the cards you're dealt, and you can better your hand by not gambling recklessly. And gambling recklessly is not doing the things that Peter so eloquently described: showering, wearing your gear properly, wearing clean gear, and I think also talking to folks like Alan and asking them, for better gear, and participating with folks like Fire-Dex and sending them good feedback on what you would like to see. And folks like Fire-Dex give you great tracking programs for your gear, and so they can tell you when the gear was last used and washed and maintained, and that's all important. That record keeping, as mundane as that might sound, it would be critical as we go forward in getting good science, because without data we can't move the ball forward. So we might be able to say, well, this person contracted something after X amount of exposures or whatever, but unless we start to keep that data, it's all for naught. And if you really care about your brothers and sisters, and we talk a lot about the brotherhood and the sisterhood of the fire service and how much we care, well, then start taking care of them. Let's emulate what Peter's doing in Ottawa and our folks in Jacksonville and Melbourne. Let's emulate that nationwide. Let's get proactive. Maybe we should really lobby hard to make gear, a second set of gear, a priority for departments across the country, and find ways to raise that money, whether it's through grant programs or fill the boots or car washes. I don't care. I really don't care, how we do it. But I think that the need is clearly there, and it's time that we act on that need. The one question we didn't get to, which I thought was kind of interesting, I don't know if you guys have this info. I know a little bit about car batteries and how to work with batteries at car fires, but Peter, do they have the same nanoparticulate danger as the ones in the buses?
Again, I'm not familiar with the Prius. I did remember the question, but the thought streams didn't go there. I'm going to say to you that there's a lot of technology in cars. It not necessarily have to be the battery, but I believe those are lithium-ion batteries. I'm not sure how they're sealed or what have you, but anywhere in the car industry, there's between 100 and 150 car parts that use nanoscale materials. Wow. And the linings of the engine block, they use ceramics. Those are nanoscale materials. And then when that engine block of aluminum melts, it releases those things. They use them in paints. If you recall, one of the big issues with paint was it wouldn't stick to vinyl. And that was the surface morphology of the vinyl, and the paint have occlusions or what have you, and it would peel off. Well, how do you make that stick? And stick in those, you put small-scale materials, particulate in there, and so you're liberating particles of a variety of sizes. In cars, depending on the builder and what have you, there is extensive use of nanoscale materials, as well as carbon fiber. And when you burn carbon fiber, you make lots of nanoscale. So hopefully that helps answer. And one thing I would like to mention, which I didn't tell you about our study, which was a surprising finding, and what that was we had, this study was done in 5 cities in Ontario, and in Ottawa I said, well, I'd like to do something different, and I took, instead of 5 people, I put 8 people, and then those 3 extra people, I had them stay on air when they came out of the fire, and I had them stand in front of a PPV fan for 1 minute, and I had them unzip the coat and open up the pants and sort of lean into the wind, if you will, while they were on air for 1 minute, and then I took them away and did exactly what we did to everybody else. So when we measured the exposures to the 5 versus the 3, because this method has been taught in Europe. When I was in Europe, I saw this as a means to, they were cleaning people off, giving them a little broom off in front of a PPV pan, and then walking them over, and they were degassing and all that stuff. We had 6 to 10 times the exposure level for the people in front of the fan. So don't stand in front of a fan. It drives it right in you.
Holy mackerel!
Yeah. So we're going to do it again tomorrow because we want to have some other data. The sophistication of these tools today, they can pick up whether you had a barbecue yesterday. So we we've excluded everyone in the test from having any kind of barbecue 24 hours before, and no not too many pops and all that sort of stuff, and no extreme exercise, because the physiology will change what those metabolites are doing, and so we want to get a good baseline, and then we're going to stick 3 more in front of a fan, in front of those 3 fans, and see how that pans out. So I believe I think we're gonna find the same result, which is we're driving it in, and you know, if you think of fire, I've always described it in my lectures as fire is a pressure phenomenon, and so that pressure goes from, you know, high pressure to low pressure. And inside your gear, I mean, you're walking in, and that gear has a lower pressure on close to your skin, and so that overpressure passes through that vapor barrier, just as your vapor is supposed to go out, outside it. But in fact, during a fire, you're in the absorption mode, and so you're sucking that stuff up. That's what our studies show us, and it's a whole body exposure. And we did not see great variability in whether it was your head, your crotch, whatever. It was, pretty much it's a whole body exposure, and so we need to interrupt that path. And the best way to do that is, if we can't get rid of the exposure, we need to reduce the dose. And the way to reduce the dose is get rid of the clothes, as Rob said. Get them cleaned properly, as I was saying. Get the right equipment to manage the gear, to ensure that it's longevity, but we need to invest in that, and then at the same time we need to wash. Those are basic things that can be done right today, low cost. They're part of a normal management of fire, and that to me is fire literacy, and that's what we're driving at. And when we talk literacy, there's many forms of literacy. Fire literacy for us is not only understanding fire dynamics, but the consequences and how to manage that post-fire and during.
Well, thank you. Before I have my guests give us their closing thoughts, I'd like to say that our Twitter winner was Chris Saraceno. And Chris, if you'd tweet us back or send me an email at roberth@penwell.com. You can get it off the Fire Engineering website, but roberth@penwell.com. We'll send you a copy of the Fire Dynamics DVD from Penwell's Books and Videos, and as a token of our appreciation from our good friends at Fire-Dex, you get the DVD of Fire Dynamics for a great question, and you were chosen at random, Chris, so that's how we choose the Twitter winner. To all the other folks that Twittered in, we really appreciate it. So I'll just start with some closing thoughts. Rob, and by the way, Rob will be doing a live televised class. He'll be speaking in Tulsa, Oklahoma on October the 10th. We'll be streaming that lecture live, The Anatomy of Smoke. So look for Rob Schnepp live on October the 10th on fireengineering.com, streaming live, The Anatomy of Smoke. Rob, some closing thoughts? And
Great. Well, thanks, Bobby. First of all, another shameless plug for firesmoke.org. If you're looking for a good place to go, you're welcome to go do that. And I like to boil things down to the simplest piece of this, and I think we're not looking for perfect in any of this. We're looking for better, and I think once the acceptance piece of this, that smoke is bad, and to whatever degree that you need to have to be convinced, once you reach that point, and I think individual firefighters decide they don't want to feel terrible after structure fires anymore, that moment of clarity will come. And some of this, I think, will hit home a little bit more. And to me, it's just all about being smarter and improving how you approach these sorts of things, because I think we are battling against our culture, and dirty gear is cool, and burnt up helmets are cool, and wandering around like an old smoke eater is still considered cool in some places. And we have to battle that, and to me that comes from the company officer. I think strong company officers backed up by good policies and strong chief officers can affect change, and that change needs to happen at 2 o'clock in the morning when a lot of people aren't looking. So my 2 cents on that is if you want to put yourself in the proper perspective as a firefighter, you can think of yourself as a a smoke diver analogous to a scuba diver, where you are completely enveloped in your environment, and that environment can kill you if you lose a constant source of air, or it could cause you problems from a health perspective if something else goes wrong. So you're really submerged in your environment. There's a lot of bad toxins in smoke. There's not one single thing you can do to cure it. There's a whole myriad of things, including all of what we've talked about here today. Good personal hygiene, good washing, as Peter says, kind of industrial hygiene things. And over a 30-year career, if you're smarter about it, I think you're going to come out better at the end of that. So thanks for having me on here. I really appreciate it. Hopefully tossed out there a couple of nuggets that might be useful for your listeners, and all the best to them and you.
Well, and you just to dovetail very quickly, you mentioned a very important term, smoke divers. And if you look at the Atlanta Smoke Divers Protocol, they're currently following virtually everything we've spoken about in this particular hangout. The washing is mandatory, the gear collection is mandatory, the exclusionary zones are far more extensive than the normal fire ground, and that's the smoke divers class. If you want more information on that, you can contact the chief elder, who is David Rhodes, the smoke daddy, and he can send you a copy of those protocols. Also, Rob, how can folks get a hold of you if they have more questions? Through smoke.org?
Yeah, they can get a hold of me through firesmoke.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn, or just Google my name and I'll come up somewhere.
Beautiful. Pete, some closing thoughts?
Well, I sort of closed off a few minutes ago talking about fire literacy, and that's what I'm focused on, is getting firefighters to understand, how fire behaves, if you will, fire dynamics, how to control that fire. In this recent foray in October, we have over 50 people coming from all over the world to work on that curriculum, and we're going to give it away for free. And included in that is, some very basic controls, and that includes a rehab, but certainly the industrial hygiene is a big focus for us as well, so that firefighters have that, and we're giving that whole show away. And how to get a hold of me is peter.mcbride@ottawa.ca, I'd be glad to answer any questions. As you know, Bobby, we're going to be bringing that program out through fire engineering as well. So,
Peter will be presenting at FDIC on fire literacy. That's going to be a workshop, so please sign up early. It does have a limited number of seats. It's 150 seats, and I think it'll sell out rather quickly. So fire literacy with Chief McBride will sell quickly.
Okay.
And also, fire engineering is very proud and humbled that Peter has asked us to help be a media partner and help with some of the dissemination of the study that Peter is leading in Canada. And we're very grateful for that opportunity, and we'll be up there assisting in any way we can to help get that information out to the entire fire service worldwide.
Yeah, well, we're hoping that, one of the things I'll be looking is giving Rob a call a little later on, because he obviously has some great connections there, and we're quite pleased to have a chat about that as well.
And the community just keeps growing. It's all about relationships, right?
Yes, it is.
So, Alan, if you could, why don't you wrap up a little bit about yourself and Fire-Dex?
Sounds good. Here's how to get a hold of me. I like your high-tech way of telling everybody on how to do it. Simply the alan@firedex.com. Mention a couple very specific studies today. Please shoot me an email, and I'll direct you where you can download all these white papers, the NIOSH study, the Tualatin Valley study, Jacksonville's documentation, the big event last April in Indianapolis. In closing, buy new bunker gear, maybe buy it from Fire-Dex, but most importantly, have good policies and procedures that you actually follow at your department, station, in your shift. Thank you.
Well, and to everybody out there who's following us on Twitter, thank you so much. Alan, Peter, Rob, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. This was great information. Alan, if you send us those documents, we'll link them to this particular Google Hangout so people can find them right there on fireengineering.com. I know all those documents are open source, and as a member of the Firefighter Cancer Support Network, thank you. I'm a board member. Thank you very much for that plug, and for full disclosure, I'm also on smoke.org. I'm a board member for the Fireside Night Treatment Coalition. But they're organizations that I truly believe in. I also support the Firefighter Cancer Support. There's a network, and then there's the coalition, firefighters group. So I support all of the groups that support firefighters and firefighter health and wellness and longevity, because it's about being around for your family after your career and being able to keep contributing after you're no longer doing the physical. You can still contribute intellectually, spiritually, socially with the fire service, as many of us do post hands-on career. But to these three gentlemen, and particularly to Fire-Dex, I mean, Fire-Dex went out on a limb. They trusted us on these Google Hangouts as to the importance of it. And I think, as you can tell by the caliber of the two gentlemen that joined us today, Rob and Peter, you won't find men that are any more involved, not only intellectually, which was obviously painfully clear how brilliant these two gentlemen are, but how passionately and how deeply they care about all of us and the future and your future and your kids and your grandkids and your grandkids, and they want us all to be healthier, and they want firefighting to be, if not safer, less risky. And it's going to involve each and every one of us, as Rob said and as Peter said. And if not me, who? And if not now, when? And thank you so much to Fire-Dex. Please go to firedex.com. Again, this is Bobby Halton in Fire Engineering. We thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. We're going to do another Google Hangout with our Fire-Dex friends next month, and we'll get you plenty of notification about that. Remember, we're going to have Rob Schnepp on October the 10th. Pete will be doing his fire literacy class. Rob will be teaching with us. And if there's anything you need from fire engineering, please don't hesitate to call on me. And remember, be careful out there.